Greetings and welcome to this webinar on reimagining our futures together, a new social contract for education. I'm Sobhi Tawil, Director of the Future of Learning and Innovation Division at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, and leading the work over the past few years on the futures of education. So what I'd like to do is perhaps give you some background on why and where this comes from, a little word on the rationale, why reimagining our futures, why now, to give a sense of the framing and some of the main content and ideas in the report. And finally, some indication of the influence that the report has been having. And I think useful to say from the outset that this type of report, and we'll come back to it, but that this type of report produced by UNESCO is essentially an invitation for public debate, for dialogue. It aims to inspire, encourage those who are moving in some of these directions in terms of educational change, educational transformation. But it essentially is an invitation to look at the broader picture and to contextualize these questions in debates in particular contexts. So on the background, the why, perhaps useful to recall that UNESCO, within the UN system, is sometimes referred to as the intellectual agency. It's not a funding agency, and therefore has a function as a kind of global think tank, a function or a role in thought leadership, including in education. And UNESCO has taken this on at key moments, key junctures of transformation, times of turbulence, if you wish, and to vision and ask the big questions about education at these key moments. The first time this was done was in the late 60s, which led to the report released in 1972, Learning to Be. And this was a particular time in recent history, time of the Cold War, time of opposing ideological models of development. It was the time of wave of independence of many of the countries in what we would call today the Global South. It was a time of turbulence, of political turmoil, of social movements, and it was a time of growth and a firm belief in scientific progress. This first report really led to thinking around education with a focus on, as the title indicates, learning to be. So the full potential of the individual, but the individual in a learning society. And in this first 1972 report, what some refer to as the FOR report, the first ideas around education throughout life, that education is not limited to formal schooling or to a period of one's life. So this was the first moment, late 60s to the early 70s. The second moment was in the mid-90s with what people refer to as the Delors Report, released in 1996, but the work began of the Commission in around 93. And this was a second moment of change. It was just after the end of the Cold War, so the end of a bipolar world. It was a time of intensification of globalization. It was, with the end of the Cold War, announcing a more dominant neoliberal model and therefore more instrumental and economistic approaches to education. And I think what is known as the Delors Report, Learning the Treasure Within, was very much welcomed by progressive educators and others because it promoted the idea of the multiple individual and collective purposes of education, encapsulated in this simple formula of the four pillars of education: learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, and learning to live together. Of those four pillars, the learning to live together was perhaps the one that carried the furthest, which also indicates the concern at the time, still a concern today, but a concern at that time, at a time of intense globalization, a concern with social cohesion, with living together, citizenship, and ensuring social cohesion and stability. That report also carried forward, obviously, the idea of education throughout life, reformulated as lifelong learning, and some would speak of lifelong and life-wide learning today. So this was the second moment where UNESCO put together a commission around these questions, looking at the state of the world, this moment of rapid change, of turbulence, and looking at what that implies for education. More recently, in 2015, UNESCO initiated the work on the Reimagining Our Futures Together through this small publication, but which went a long way around rethinking education, titled Rethinking Education Towards a Global Common Good. This was in 2015, at the same time that the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, the 2030 agenda, was adopted, and you see here, obviously, the 17 goals of that agenda. This publication in 2015 that UNESCO put out, Education as a Common Good, really introduced the most innovative piece in terms of conceptualization, was to think of education as a common good, meaning it is about reaffirming the collective dimension of education, that education, yes, is a personal, individual learning trajectory, but it is also a societal project. It's a public endeavor and does have a collective dimension that it is important to reaffirm. When we say education as a common good, we also mean that it is a shared responsibility, and that all constituencies in society need to be involved, from visioning and policy dialogue to actual delivery, if you want, and monitoring and accountability. So shared responsibility across multiple constituencies also means that there needs to be modalities of cooperation and ideally, ideally around principles of solidarity. And finally, education as a common good also implies if there are multiple constituencies, then we need mechanisms and spaces for participatory democracy where these voices can be heard and can contribute to this collective endeavor. In 2021, building on that rethinking education, UNESCO released in late 2021 Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education, with this idea of renewing the social contract for education, and we will be I'll be saying a little bit more in a minute. But where did this come from? It might be useful to recall that UN Secretary General visited UNESCO in late 2018, and in his conversation with the Director General of UNESCO, called upon UNESCO, and you see the citation, to take on its leadership role in the debate on the future of education. This was UN Secretary General in late 2018 requesting UNESCO to take up that role and to lead the global debate on the future of education. So the reimagining our futures together is a response to that. And in the tradition of previous reports, first put together a commission of thought leaders from different sectors, and the commission was led at the time by Her Excellency President of Ethiopia, President Sahle-Work Zewde. But just to say that there was also perhaps more than had been the case in the past with previous reports, a dual process. There was the work of the commission on one hand, in a sense behind closed doors, but this was very much informed by a very broad process of consultation around the world. You see here on the map a little bit the sites at which there were focus group discussions. There were contributions in the form of background papers. There were social media surveys, many contributions in total, some 1 million individuals of different, very, very different profiles contributing to the thinking around how the future is being perceived and what that meant for education. Now, why at this moment, why did UN Secretary General call on UNESCO to lead this debate in late 2018? Why was this work on reimagining our futures again, reimagining our futures together initiated in 2019 with the report released in 2021? And perhaps useful to refer to a 2021 report of the UN Secretary General, where he basically argues that humanity faces an urgent choice, that we find ourselves at a crossroads in terms of global development, and the stark and urgent choice is a choice between breakdown or breakthrough. And this refers to the climate crisis, to the overconsumption. This is just back from 2018, the Global Footprint Network, at that time in 2018, saying that we were estimating that we were using up renewable resources that were equivalent to 1.7 Earths, so overconsumption, and that if we kept consumption at this rate, that we would need the equivalent of 3 Earths in terms of renewable resources by 2050. So all of this contributing to the environmental crisis, issues of demographic change, that the population of the world between 1990 and 2050 is set to double, that there is a higher concentration of the world's population in Africa, estimated to become 1/4 of the world's population in 2050, and 40% of the world's population by the end of the century. But also issues around, obviously, the demographic structure and the aging of the population, and projections that you see here for 2050 of over 2 billion people aged 60 years or over, and over 3 billion by the end of the century, with all the implications that this has for social services, education, health, jobs, and welfare, and the weight and responsibility that represents for public services. So the climate crisis, demographic issues, the democratic backsliding is something that we have witnessed over the past 15 to 20 years. And just to take this from Freedom House, which was looking at the decline in freedoms over a 15-year period from 2005 2021, that every year between 2005 and 2021, the number of countries where freedoms, fundamental freedoms, had declined outnumbered the number of countries where there were improvements in fundamental freedoms. And some were already mentioning at the time an age of authoritarian rule, and things have unfortunately not improved in the very recent years, as we know. So climate crisis, demographic changes, a deficit in democracy, and more recently, artificial intelligence and the waves of AI systems and their growing capacities and the implications at all levels. In education, we have obviously looked at that, but also what that means in terms of the future of work. So these combined challenges led the UN Secretary General to frame our moment, our historical moment, this juncture, as a crossroads. And this is echoed in the Reimagining Our Futures report in its framing. And you see the citation here, that we face an existential choice. We either continue on an unsustainable path or we radically change course in terms of development. But changing course, education is key to changing course, but it cannot be the same education. Just to take some of the figures that we all know, people speak of the learning crisis of the educational model, that we still have over 250 million children and youth out of school. We still have over 750 million youth and adults who are non-literate. We know the challenges around the quality of education. 6 out of 10 15-year-olds not acquiring the minimal competencies, but also questions of relevance of education when we see that close to half of secondary students do not complete that cycle. So questions around our model. Our model is certainly not working for everyone. We are not realizing the right to education for all children, youth, and adults. So something around the model that needs more fundamental questioning, but also education might be part of the problem that is leading us to this crossroads and this urgent choice that we need to make. And if we take just the question of education and the environment, and these are citations from the report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, the world's most educated countries and people are the ones that are most accelerating climate change. So what does education really mean? If being educated means living unsustainably, we need to recalibrate our notions of what education should do. So yes, perhaps to rethink an education that is based very much on individual accomplishments, an education that is based on selection, on competition, on exclusion, on human exceptionalism. So some reasons to be fundamentally questioning our educational approaches, not only because it's not working for everyone, but it might actually, our ways of doing education might actually be part of the problem that we find ourselves in. Now, what does the report actually propose in terms of framing? It's really a question of rebalancing our relationships. we mentioned the Delors report, 1996, Learning to Live Together. The first relationship is obviously with each other, the human to human. So the issues of social cohesion and ensuring respect for human dignity, for diversity. But today we need to go beyond. It's also rebalancing our relationship with the planet. I'd mentioned this idea of human exceptionalism. We need an education that reframes the way we relate as humans to the natural environment around us. And more recently, with AI, the third dimension, that we need to rebalance our relationship with technology, the human to machine. And we know that AI is raising the most fundamental questions around what it means really to be human, what human intelligence is, and is forcing us actually to rethink some very fundamental questions around the way we think and do education. The Reimagining Our Futures report proposes this concept of social contract, renewing the social contract. It was language that was also used by the UN Secretary General in his report, Our Common Agenda. Sorry. And the understanding of social contract is actually the understanding within a society how people solve shared problems, manage risks, pool resources to deliver public goods, as well as how their collective institutions and norms operate. That's the UN understanding of the notion of social contract. It is useful to mention that in 2022, UNRIS, the UN Research Institute for Social Development, put out this report, Crises of Inequality, and they framed it around a new eco-social contract, really bringing in the environmental and ecological dimension as well. So as we were saying, rebalancing our relationship to each other, human to human, rebalancing our relation to the natural environment, and rebalancing our relationship with technology. So new social contract for education means rethinking the purposes, the fundamental principles, the why of education, and this is very often overlooked in discussions about the futures of education. We often look at what needs to be learned, how that needs to be learned and taught, but very seldom do we interrogate the question of why, the why of learning. The Futures of Education report two foundational principles. One is expanding our understanding of the right to education, so that the right to education must be understood as the right to education throughout life, and better to keep this principle than to start to compartmentalize the idea of the right to education, right to schooling, right to learning, right to higher education, right to adult learning. It should be a thread that runs through our thinking on education as the right to education throughout life. Second way of expanding our understanding of the right to education is to link it to other rights, that the right to education must be seen jointly with other rights, such as the right to information, the right to participation, the right to science, etc. Second principle, education as a common good. We had mentioned that, growing out of the 2015 Rethinking report, Rethinking Education report. And perhaps just to say here that what that notion of common good also does is to bring out, to make us aware of what constitutes the publicness of public education. In other words, public education, or the publicness of education, is an education that serves public purposes, that happens in public spaces, and that is accountable to the public. Here are some of the main messages, let's say, around pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity, with guiding principles of interconnectedness, interdependence, learning to learn together. It's one could say the same about problem-solving skills. It's also learning to solve problems together, learning to care, learning to unlearn some of our prejudice and stereotypes. So pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity. In terms of curriculum, more ecological, more emphasis on ecological dimensions, intercultural approaches, and interdisciplinarity. So relearning the place of the human, emphasizing the importance of humanities and the arts, human rights and citizenship, obviously, and critical media and information literacy or scientific literacy, increasingly important in our digital world. 3, teaching as a collaborative profession, and this has influenced the recent World Teacher Summit that was organized in Santiago at the end of the month of August this year, which was framed around this strong idea from the Futures of Education report, teaching as a collaborative profession, also supporting autonomy and academic freedom, that teachers should be actively involved also in knowledge, reflection, and research, and in public debates, obviously, on the futures of education. Redefining times and spaces of education, learning as lifelong, life-wide, that connecting networks of learning spaces, which can be educational, but also social, cultural, professional, natural spaces, in addition to the digital. A final just set of words just before closing on impact, or what I would rather call influence. It is difficult to try to ascribe any change that may be observed directly to a report of this kind, but we can say that there has been great influence at the global level and at national level. Just the fact that it has been translated into so many languages, and just next week will be the release of the Greek version in Athens. It will include representatives. It is serving its purpose in these many contexts to prompt public debate on these questions of education and renewing the social contract. Next week's release of the Greek version will include representatives of political parties. There will be a conversation around renewing the social contract for education in Greece with the former prime minister as a public conversation. So these many versions show that there indicates that there is relevance and a demand to contextualize these discussions in various national and local contexts. But perhaps the greatest influence has been in terms of influencing global policy discussions. And here you see some, in particular, just after its release at the World Higher Education Conference in 2022, at the International Conference, the 7th International Conference on Adult Learning and Education in Marrakesh, at the Global Campaign for Education World Assembly, but also at the Transforming Education Summit in New York, organized by the Secretary General in September 2022. And just perhaps a word here to say that the objectives of that UN Transforming Education Summit, the Futures of Education report was the key reference cited by the Secretary General in inviting heads of states to engage in public dialogues around the futures of education, inviting them to refer to the Reimagining Our Futures Together as a starting point. The objectives of the Transforming Education Summit were threefold. One, this was in 2022, so respond to the COVID disruption. 2, get SDG 4 back on track. And 3, transform education, as the title indicates. A quick word to say that of these 3 objectives, and this is, I think, one of our challenges, in global education. Responding to COVID-19 disruption is reactive. It's short term. It locks us into the logic of the short term and emergency crisis response. It's necessary, but there is no room to innovate, to reimagine, and to transform. The second objective, getting SDG 4 back on track, is also a medium-term objective. So looking more in terms of what is already set, the global goals and commitments around SDG 4, and to accelerate. So the first is reactive, a crisis response. The second, medium term, is to accelerate. And transform is really what we're looking at, the longer term, the future's thinking, the shaping a different kind of education to transform the future. This somehow dropped off the agenda of the UN Transforming Education Summit, and it shows the difficulty in education policy of combining the short-term needs with this longer-term futures thinking. But that is precisely what we need, longer-term thinking. I'd like to cite this, which came out just end of last year. How thinking about the future shapes the present. And it's a century of tomorrows. This is by Glenn Adamson, looking at representations of the future over the 20th century. But the key point is how thinking about the future shapes the present. It is not a luxury for us to be thinking about alternative possible futures. It is a necessity, and doing that helps us reframe our actions in the present. Some of our very recent publications, just from last month, AI in the Future of Education, Disruptions, Dilemmas, and Directions. I encourage you to also have a look. We organized just last December the first International Forum on the Futures of Education. And the publication is available online, and you'll see here the 7 directions for change that were proposed, including the first one, adopting longer-term futures thinking. So it is about shifting the narrative from probable futures to possible alternative futures, from a short-term emergency response mindset to longer-term thinking, shifting the narrative from adapting to change to actually steering and shaping the change we want to see, shifting the narrative from preparing the next generation to one of empowering this generation today, now, and shifting the narrative from reform, incremental change, to transform and shaping the futures we want. So key areas of renewal, the why question of why we learn, obviously what we teach and learn, how we teach, learn, assess, validate learning, but also how we organize learning spaces and connect different learning spaces in a broader educational ecosystem. I'll leave you with the 3 main questions that is the invitation of this report on reimagining our futures together. We're not starting from scratch. We have strengths to build on. So what should be continued? What should be strengthened? What should be protected because it's being undermined? In some of our educational experience, we have strengths to build on, and that's our starting point. But second, we should also be thinking about what needs to go, what needs to be abandoned because it's not working, perhaps despite our best intents, but what in our educational approaches and understandings needs to be abandoned. And finally, in this moment that we are in, what needs to be completely reimagined, and AI systems and their growing capabilities are certainly forcing us to rethink and to reimagine the purpose of education, the what and how, and the way in which education is experienced for children, youth, and adults, whether in formal education or beyond. So I'd like to leave you with these three questions, and thank you very much for your attention.